the internet, anyone can claim to be an expert, right? Anyone can set up shop on the internet and say that they know what they're talking about. And at the end of the day, you need to make a decision on whether or not you believe that that's a legitimate source.
Hello and welcome to my channel. My name is Frank Cusimano. I have a PhD in nutrition and metabolic biology. And for anyone who's been following me on Instagram, you know that one of my passions is the gut microbiome. For my PhD, I specifically worked on advanced bacterial therapeutics, targeting specific disease processes and trying to use bacteria as tools or future therapeutics. Now, I have a really good episode for you guys today. I sat down on Instagram Live with one of my favorite physicians and gastroenterologists, Dr. Bulsiewicz. He has a brand new book that just came out. It's called Fiber Fueled, and it is a plant-based gut health program for losing weight, restoring health, and optimizing your microbiome. Now, most of the microbiome or gut health books out there, guys, I would not recommend. They are not backed by science. And a lot of times they take small, discussion points in a paper and they blow it up and they try to make it sound like it's going to heal everything. But Dr. B in this book really does break down the science and goes through his recommendations based off of the science. And as a gastroenterologist treating these disease processes, whether it's IBS, IBD, Crohn's, ulcerative colitis, and he kind of goes through in the book about how you can use fiber and diet to heal your gut. So you guys are going to love this episode. What I did is the original episode was about 45 minutes that we did. I broke it up, took it into some parts, and then want to share it with you guys, share it with the audience on YouTube. This book is a fantastic book, and everything he talks about in there is evidence-based. There are a lot of key phrases in the gut microbiome research area that just trigger me the wrong way because they're not backed by science. This book isn't filled with any of them. This book is filled with tools and tips that you can do on a daily basis to help optimize your gut. And I think Dr. B is the one to deliver this message in a right way. The book is about 400 pages. It's on Amazon. It's on all different book retailers that you can buy it at. The first 200 pages is just the science and things that you can do to implement into your daily life. And then the last 200 pages is a 28-day dietary program that will help optimize your gut health and kind of breaks down, some of the nutrient-rich foods that you need to be incorporating into your diet. He gives full diet plans and discusses why he recommends each food. So you guys are going to love it. Without any further ado, let's turn it over to Dr. Bulsiewicz.
So half of my PhD research was actually on butyrate. Half of my PhD thesis was like 238 pages or 237 pages, and I think the latter, like 113 pages, were all on butyrate. So I know butyrate. You and I both share that love and that passion for butyrate. Do you want to explain it a little bit? I know you talk about it in the book, but I think it's just an interesting topic that I think people don't know enough about, or they hear short chain fatty acid and they don't necessarily know it. But at least if you kind of give a little primer to it, people will know what to expect in part of your book.
Well, let me say this, and I know that you can appreciate this, Frank. If I had my way, would have written at least double, if not triple, the number of pages about short chain fatty acids. And, but the problem is, like, you can't write a book for public consumption that you just nerd out entirely about the science of something that I consider to be wildly overlooked. And so the story here is this, that fiber doesn't just go in the mouth and come out the other end. Fiber is actually, at least certain types of fiber, the soluble fiber, is consumed by the microbes that live inside of us. And that's their food. So the food that the parts of our diet that are able to, survive digestion and not be absorbed in our small intestine, they make it to the large intestine, the colon, where these microbes live. And they basically get into a feeding frenzy and they eat it. That is what makes fiber prebiotic. And when they eat it, these microbes, they get stronger, they multiply, and then they want to pay us back. And the way that they pay us back is by transforming the fiber, basically restructuring it, and changing it into what are called short chain fatty acids. And the ones that we're referring to are butyrate, acetate, and propionate. And you don't need to know the differences between these three. That's like extremely high level stuff that most doctors don't know. Yeah. But what's key to know is that these short chain fatty acids are incredibly healing, and healing in ways that are mind-blowing and fascinating. Because, for example, if you take the idea of dysbiosis, where some people will refer to this on the internet as leaky gut. I know that this is not something that we like to call it, but we're talking about dysbiosis, damage to the gut microbiome, which includes breakdown of the epithelial layer, the wall around the colon, breaking down the cells and opening them up. And that allows toxins to sneak into the bloodstream. And you want to fix that. This is the solution. Short chain fatty acids. In the book, I lay out in chapter 3 how they can reverse each step that's involved in dysbiosis. Now, Frank, I was talking this morning with the Shirzais.
Mm-hmm.
So for the listeners on our call right now, Dean and Aisha Shirzai are the authors of the book, The Alzheimer's Solution. They're incredible neurologists. And I am convinced that the blood-brain barrier is functionally the same as the blood-gut barrier, in that it's the tight junctions that keep everything together. And butyrate repairs that too. Butyrate repairs the tight junctions in the brain too. So the healing effects involve the gut. Butyrate also, and these short chain fatty acids are capable of affecting your immune system, which is very relevant these days. They affect cholesterol, our insulin resistance, type 2 diabetes. They affect our weight balance and our satiety after a meal. They actually can spread throughout the entire body. And as I said, they can go all the way up to the brain, and they can affect neurologic function. So these are healing molecules that have huge effects throughout the entire body, that are anti-inflammatory. And if you believe that inflammation is at the root of disease, which most people do, then we should be striving to get more of these. And that is where the problem lies, which is that we haven't been talking about these. We've been talking about lectins and gluten and all these things that, frankly, we're blowing out of proportion. And really what we need to instead be focusing on, where am I going to get my fiber from? Because fiber is what gives us the short chain fatty acids.
Yeah, and one thing I think most people don't realize is, like, when you think about different macronutrients, right? You want to think about which macronutrients and what they're going to do for your body. Most people know protein is going to be good to build up your muscles. Most people know that sugar is going to allow your cells to fuel themselves and to generate ATP and to be used for energy. Most people don't realize, though, that butyrate, which, is that short chain fatty acid that comes from eating fiber. Most people don't realize that the colonocytes, the cells that line your colon, they actually use butyrate for energy production. Like, yep. That's their primary source of energy production. So without that butyrate, without that fiber, the cells of your colon just don't have the primary source of energy that they need to be able to do their functioning properly, which I think, to me, it's just mind blowing that it's actually from fiber that our cells' energy are tracked to get their energy from.
There's for the 117 people who are here with us right now, I hope you guys don't mind me nerding out for a moment, because I'm talking to my friend who I think we love to nerd out. So, but there is a researcher at the University of Michigan. His name is Eric Martins, and he has been studying the effects of fiber on the epithelial layer, and he's looked specifically at the mucus lining. And what he's found is that when you go on a low fiber diet over the course of about 4 weeks, you will thin out that mucus lining, and it's disastrous for essentially the gut and the health of the gut.
Well, two of my other topics that I wanted to talk about on my list one was leaky gut, and I think we'll come back to that in a second because I have one question. But I want to hit the next one, and that was actually the mucosal layer. Because so there's this weird, I call it like a symbiotic relationship, and it's the relationship between fiber, what fiber does, between the colonocytes and the goblet cells that produce mucus, and then also saturated fat, right? If you're cutting out a lot of the fiber from your diet, you're going to probably be taking in more fat, right? Most people, that's kind of the trade-off that they get with cutting out fiber. They intake their fat intake. And saturated fat has been shown to reduce mucus production. So it's interesting that it's kind of, there's two-prong effect of maybe why that mucus production is lower, based off of the saturated fat and the fiber differences. I don't know if you talked about that, or if you've ever done any research into that, but that to me is just fascinating.
Well, and I think what it boils down to is this, when we talk about stuff like that, it brings me back to one of my two favorite studies, which is Lawrence David et al. From Nature 2014.
Mhm.
This is the diet rapidly and reproducibly alters the gut microbiome study. And for the people who are listening at home, this was where they took people and they put them on 5 days of either a completely whole food plant-based diet versus 5 days of a completely animal product diet, like meat, dairy, and eggs with no plants at all. And they looked to see what would happen to the gut microbiome. And in literally 24 hours, there were already radical changes to the gut microbiome.
Mm-hmm.
And when you look at the changes that occurred in the animal-based diet, to me, they were disturbing. You saw the emergence, no surprise, of the bacteria that thrive in an environment with bile. And these are almost uniformly inflammatory microbes. These are the types of microbes that produce secondary bile salts that cause colon cancer. These are the types of microbes that will produce TMAO associated with heart disease, stroke, chronic kidney disease. And one particular microbe that emerged dramatically in this study was Bilophila wadsworthia,
Mm-hmm.
which it has been strongly associated with the development of inflammatory bowel disease. Now, the thing that I always think about with this study is because there was literally it was just all or nothing. 100% plants versus 100% animal products. The thing that I've always wondered is it the absence of fiber, or is it the presence of saturated fat, or both? And we have studies with fiber, and we have studies with saturated fat, and it leads me to believe that it is both. That saturated fat, not only it's not that it's net neutral, it's that the saturated fat in animal products, and full disclosure, coconut oil, coconut milk, that the saturated fat actually is inflicting harm on the gut microbiome. And we do have some animal model studies to support that.
Yeah.
And then obviously the opposite is true, which is that fiber is nourishing to the gut microbiome and what it needs to thrive and survive.
Yeah, and I think that's probably the most important part is people need to realize that it is that two-pronged approach, because we have studies that show that it's both. It's not just one way or the other. So let's talk a little bit about leaky gut, because leaky gut to me, that's in your book. That was one of the first keywords I looked up. Because so what I did is I went through your book, kind of the whole thing, and then I went back to look up keywords, key phrases, try to figure out, what are the hot topics? What are you saying about it? Because leaky gut is an interesting thing that I think you as a gastroenterologist knows that, it's not something clinically that we discuss. It's not something that the medical profession as a whole wants to discuss or agrees with. But on a research side of it, taking the clinical side out of it, me as a researcher, I can measure OCTN2. I can measure the tight junctions or the different the proteins that bind cells in your gut and say, hey, there is a change here, right? So why don't you kind of give me your opinion about it, or what's the permitting of the profession versus you versus the research? And I'll kind of maybe chime in with some of my my opinions or some of the things that I've seen on the research.
Yeah. Well, I think that we are in a place now where there is no gold standard test for dysbiosis. Mm-hmm. Okay. And researchers, they know it when they see it. So, globally speaking, it's this idea of a loss of diversity and the emergence of, what we would characterize as inflammatory microbes, and the diminished presence of the anti-inflammatory microbes. So that's sort of where it starts from a bacterial or like a microbial populations perspective. And what you end up seeing is then there's the breakdown of the tight junctions, which leads to increased intestinal permeability. Now, do I believe that there are any tests, whether it's microbiome tests or intestinal permeability tests, that are ready for clinical use? No, I do not.
Yeah.
I do not.
I mean, they've tried that with like the mannitol lactose ones and stuff like that, but still, yeah, I'm with you on that.
And so I think that where we're at is, this is the way that I feel about it. I think that there is no question that this exists. Okay. I've never seen a study, by the way, Frank, and correct me if you have, but I've never seen a study where a person had increased intestinal permeability in the absence of the alterations of the microbes. Meaning that I think that increased intestinal permeability in leaky gut is not in isolation. Instead, that increased intestinal permeability in leaky gut is a part of the entire phenotype, the complex of dysbiosis.
Yeah, no,
And
I 100% I agree with you, because the one part that I was going to bring up at the end, and you already kind of brought it up in this, is that it's not just it's not just the cells. You have to think about the whole environment, the bacteria, and also as we mentioned earlier, the mucosal layer. You could have the same, in my opinion, this is just personally, this is going more on the research side and less on the clinical side, because I'll leave that to you. On the research side is I think about the aspect of, if you look at the tight junctions, if you look at cells on the epithelial layer, you could have the same cells, or the same, I would say the structural integrity in one, colon with a really good mucosal layer. And that mucosal layer is going to buffer any of the harsh impact of anything that's coming against it. Or you could have the same, in structural integrity of the epithelial layer, and then have no mucus that's not being buffered at all. So it really is kind of the whole ecosystem. And, you can't just say that it's just that, it's just the tight junctions, or the cells are letting things leak through. No, you got to look at the microbiome. You have to look at the mucosal layer. You have to look at the protective effects, what dietary components are in the GI tract that could be causing harm or feeding the local environment. So yeah, I agree completely with you that it's that entire dysbiosis versus entire environment that you have to look at there.
Yeah, and I think too, one of the other things that you will commonly see, so when we're looking at the entire environment, we should include the metabolic products of these microbes. Mm-hmm. And that's where, to me, shotgun sequencing is such a superior test to the old-fashioned way of doing things, because it allows us to look into that. And, to me, one of the keys here is that when they think about a healthy microbiome, that includes a microbiome not just in terms of the bacteria capable of producing short-chain fatty acids, but the actual presence of short-chain fatty acids, which are having their effect within that environment, actively. And it's all intertwined in a way where when you eat fiber, you will initiate this process like a snowball of getting more microbes that are capable of producing short-chain fatty acids, which then creates a feedback loop where you just keep ramping up and getting more and more of these microbes, and there's increased efficiency, so that the person who basically is constantly consuming a predominantly plant-based diet has a microbiome developed for that diet that is going to continue to produce maximum amounts of short-chain fatty acids to heal and have anti-inflammatory effects throughout the body. And this is where, for me, this is more than just, because the problem with many of the alternative dietary choices is that there are things about the ketogenic diet that in the short term are like indisputable.
Yeah.
Right. And there are things about it that if you're looking at it through the proper lens, through certain lenses, you look at it and say, wow, that's appealing. That's a good metabolic effect, or whatever it may be. Okay. And I'm not disputing those things in the short term. But here's the question. This is the real question. What is the diet that gives you the benefit in the short term, and will actually keep you healthy when you're 50, 60, 70? Going to give you that health as you age, going to protect you from heart disease, the number one killer, going to protect you from cancer, the number two killer. And the problem is that going high fat, high protein, low carb, and having very little dietary fiber is a setup for heart disease and cancer.
Yeah, no, that's one of the most important things is I think we can nerd out on the science of, what's the mucosal layer doing versus this bacteria versus that bacteria, but it all comes down to what's your fiber intake, how much fiber are you consuming, and then what is the total nutritional makeup of your dietary choices. It doesn't have to be 100% whole food plant-based to get the maximal benefit, right? There is probably a degree of gray in the middle, but it's really important to point out that without the foods high in fiber, you're not going to get the benefits that you need from the short chain fatty acids and the motility, how fiber affects motility and everything. So I think that's the important part, that a lot of times me as a scientist, I get lost in the details and forget that big picture wise, let's just keep eating the fiber.
Well, and this is where there's layers to the evidence, and we like seeing all the layers pointing in the same direction. And when you think about fiber, we see it in our, basic science studies. We see it in our animal model studies. We see it in human microbiome studies. We see it in systematic reviews and meta-analyses of population-based studies. All levels point to the same thing, which is that fiber heals and fiber is good for our body. So a person who stands, I mean, look, the internet, people, I want people to understand that the internet, anyone can claim to be an expert, right? Anyone can set up shop on the internet and say that they know what they're talking about. And at the end of the day, you need to make a decision on whether or not you believe that that's a legitimate source. Mm-hmm. In trades, in certain trades, states have put into place protections. Okay. Now those protections are meant to be for the consumer. You know, like the internet doesn't have these protections, but like, for example, I need to have a medical license in order to practice medicine. All right. And my medical board, if I do something crazy to protect the people of our community, will potentially take my license away from me.
Well, it brings up the part that just cracks me up is before your book and your understanding, like you already mentioned shotgun sequencing. I know you understand microbial sequencing and what it takes to actually look at someone's microbiome, not only a patient's been doing a research or whether it's acute changes or longitudinal changes, but I can tell you that almost everyone that talks about the microbiome out there has never actually sequenced someone's microbiome, right? Like, and that part to me just blows my mind. I don't know if it's something you do in your practice or it's something you don't, but the fact that you know the difference between 16S RNA sequencing, you know the difference between, shotgun sequencing or metagenome sequencing, it just shows that, the level of care that you've taken to put into this book and your clinical expertise from your master's of clinical investigation, which I know you have, it really does make a big difference because all these other people that are talking about the microbiome who don't understand that, when you sequence someone's microbiome, you're sequencing their stool. You're not sequencing their epithelial layer. You're not sequencing their small intestine. You're not sequencing their stomach because each part of the GI tract in each location, topography wise, from the center of the colon to the epithelial cells, it has a different composition in the microbes. And that is a really important part that most people don't realize or have never done or may not understand that is a big difference.
Well, that's the real challenge that we have in terms of studying this is that I wish it was so simple as just getting stool specimens from everyone, but that's the challenge is that I think that there's geographic variability within the, and not just segmented. I mean, we think about it as anatomic segments, but I think certainly within the colon, there's geographic variability and they've shown this, the variability in terms of the pH within the colon in different segments. And, for example, more distally in the colon, typically the fiber will actually be consumed by the time that the feculent material gets down to the distal colon. And there, actually, it's the protein that's being used to create short-chain fatty acids in the distal colon. So it's just fascinating. But it's hard to study it, the way that we really need to fully separate. But I think the bottom line is this, Frank, is that I think that we know enough, right? I think that we know we're not yet in a place where we have the specificity to analyze a person's microbiome and use that information to tell them whether or not they're going to have Crohn's disease.
Yeah, correct.
Right? We just don't have that yet. But what we do have is this. We understand the basic biology and mechanisms of the microbiome. And that's really what my book is about using the basics of our lifestyle, diet and lifestyle, to swing the pendulum in our favor and heal our microbiome because there's core concepts that we may implement in our own unique ways. Like, even though you and I eat a 100% whole food plant-based diet, you and I are not eating the exact same food on a daily basis. That's not a one size fits all. Those are unique versions of a similar concept. And, and I think that that's really, to me, what my book is about, is showing people that there is this path to heal your gut that is clear at this point. And you just need to use the book as your compass to move towards healing your gut. And where you choose to ultimately settle, like, I don't know if you caught it in the back of the book, but I ultimately say, look, if you make yourself 90% plant-based, I got no argument from a health perspective.
Yeah, correct.
I honestly think that the strongest argument to go from 90 to 100, at that point, the strongest argument is actually animal welfare and the environment. And I think that there are legitimate arguments to be made and people should learn about those things. But if you get to 90%, I mean, that's up to you. I personally think that you're going to feel so good at 90, you're going to go, why would I stop at 90 when I could go to 95?
Yeah.
But that's just me.
I mean, I'm right there with you. And that's the thing, is I've been on a lot of other podcasts that are not plant-based specific podcasts. And I think that's the important part, is that it's not a one size fits all. You don't need to go to that 100% necessarily. There are definitely benefits of going 100%, but getting to that 90% where you're incorporating as much plants and the diversity of plants, because we haven't even mentioned that, is that the diversity of plants in your diet is one of the most important things for microbial health and the microbial diversity, which is, synonymous with gut health overall.
Right. Yeah. And, this is where I get concerned about things like some people will implement a ketogenic diet, and they'll say, oh, we have learned our lesson through the couple of years of this fad that you need some fiber. And so we're not going to count that fiber. We're going to call it net carbs, and we're going to remove the fiber. Okay. Well, look, I'll give it to you. That's a step in the right direction. But here's the issue. It's not, this. It's not grams of fiber that predicts the health of the gut microbiome.
Yeah.
It's the diversity, and it's what percentage of your diet is made up of plant food, which contains fiber, relative to the other stuff. If you think about everything as a scale, right now, the average American has 10% of their diet that is actual, real plant food, fruits, vegetables, whole grain, seeds, nuts, and legumes. And 90% of their diet is either animal products or processed food. So that means 90% of their diet is destroying their microbiome. And that's where we need to flip the scale and have the weight of the balance being on the side that's actually protecting our gut and feeding it and nourishing it. Yeah. Right? There is no accepted single greatest microbiome on the planet. If that existed, I think it would be Nimai Delgado, but that's just me.
That's true.
Yeah, but there is no, I think that there's multiple forms of healthy. And the question is, what is actually changing when a person develops, say, irritable bowel syndrome, right? We know that the microbiome has changed, but what is it? And there may be different variations. I'm sure there are different variations of what's occurring in the microbiome. And that's part of probably what explains different variations on how we manifest. And we need the ability to first, I think, make the connection between clinical phenotype and microbiome findings. And then the next level is, how do we adapt it to get it back to something that's closer to normal, and validating that within a population of people, taking people with IBS and showing, because this is really where I'm like, look, I saw some people who were asking questions in our little bar here about the GI map. And it's like, look, you can collect information and you can throw information at people, but if you never validate that information, then what's the use of it?
Yeah,
if you never demonstrate that you can improve health outcomes, what's the use of information? That's pointless. So, and my mentor at UNC, Nick Shaheen, would say, people who order tests always, they, what did he say? It was always, you get what you deserve when you order the test, is what he used to say. Because a lot of people will order tests and then they'll get the results back and they'll go, oh crap, I don't know how to interpret this. What does this mean? And it's like, well, why did you order the test?
Yeah, it's like when to and when not to order a D-dimer, right? It's like, right. Well,
exactly.
There's always those tests. But on the science front, I would say that I'm a little different, at least on the valueness of science. I think that there's some things that we definitely do in science that maybe aren't clinically relevant, but I think they're a building block that we need to do now so that in the future we could understand stuff. So, but I think on the clinical side of it, I think that's the difference that you see between, a PhD versus an MD, the clinician side of it, is that there's definitely research that I did that clinically it may not have any clinical implication, but can it be used for future relevant research? Absolutely. And so that's the thing, is you have to be tricky in how you're discussing that research and saying it's the difference of test tube experiments versus patient population experiments, right?
Well, listen, Frank, it's always a pleasure. This is the book, guys, Fiber Fueled. And I wanted to tell you real quick that there was a section in the book, I think in chapter 1, where I talk about serotonin, and I talk about the 5-HT precursors. And I want you to know that when I wrote that sentence, I was thinking of you, my friend.
Yes.
When I wrote that sentence, you have made an impact.
Yeah, the serotonin thing, don't get me started. I wrote a whole post on it and people got mad that I was telling them about serotonin, but yeah, that's I appreciate and thankful that you thought of me when you were writing that section of the book.
You are correct, and I want you to know that I please do not judge me when I say 90% of serotonin is in the gut, because I always try to go out of my way to say that the serotonin does not cross the blood-brain barrier, but some of the precursor molecules we think do in fact cross the blood-brain barrier, which is part of the reason why diet can affect mood.
All right, I hope you guys got a lot out of that. I had a great time sitting down with Dr. B and discussing his book and some of the highlights from the book. If you guys want to pick up a copy, make sure to check the links in the show notes below. It is something that I highly recommend. And if you like this episode or you want to hear future guests like this, make sure to go ahead and leave a comment below. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, make sure you do. Make sure to give us a thumbs up if you like this video. And I will see you guys in the next video. Thanks for coming.